Welcome to our third season of our podcast, Roots to Leaves, coming out of Community Church in New York City. My name is Jude Geiger. I'm the Minister for Community Engagement here at Community Church, and I'm joined this year, as I have for a while now, with Brother Zachary, our chaplain for pastoral care. And this season, we're also welcoming our student minister, Dr. Yvonne Garrett, who will be joining us for many of these podcasts. And in this session, we're doing something different. We're adding interviewees. And for this session, we're welcoming Linnea Nelson, Executive Director of UU Wellspring and longtime leader in Laredo. And before we all start, I want to give us a little bit of a context of what this podcast has been, real briefly. When this started 3 seasons ago now, we're in our third season, it was intended to be a program for adult learning around Unitarian Universalist, UU history and theology and polity. And after a year of that, we decided to mix it up a little bit, and we brought in Brother Zachary, and we're looking at what are the contemporary theological issues in Unitarian Universalism from more than one lens. Brother Zachary comes to us from the Progressive Catholic Church, although he is a staff member and minister on our team here. And we looked at our principles, our 8 principles throughout the year. And this year, we're adapting again to look at our new UU values and how they're articulated. Some of them are used to the Article 2 Commission. I imagine at some point we will stop calling it that and we'll just call it our values. But this season, we're following along with them with what I think of as probably the most robust program being offered to do so, Wellspring. And I wanted to invite Linnea Nelson to say a couple of words on how UU Wellspring is addressing this major moment in Unitarian Universalist identity.
Thank you, Reverend Jude. Well, UU Wellspring has just this deep interest in providing materials that will really engage people at a deep level. And so when we heard talk of looking at shared values and covenant statements as coming into our formal vernacular, we were like, oh, this is an opportunity. This is an opportunity to take what UU Wellspring has done for almost 20 years and help our congregations and all of us to really connect deeply with these shared values, really see how we can live into the covenant statements. And our newest program is called Love at the Center, UU Values and Covenants. And we hope that all of you who are studying the values and the covenant statements will take it beyond the intellectual level, whether with UU Wellspring or however else you are engaging with these values, because in order to really take them in, we need some experience with them. We've been working on this program for 2 years, and now we're kind of bringing it all together into a longer program that we hope will really transform people's lives through this experience.
Thank you so much. And we're hoping for this season to look at the questions of our values and what do they mean to us and for us in relationship with one another in today's world. And we're coming at it from a bunch of different lenses. Brother Zachary is a progressive Catholic priest, Franciscan order, and Dr. Yvonne is a UU and a humanist. And I'm, what most of the globe would call someone with multiple belonging. I feel very comfortable in many religious traditions. I identify as UU, but I'm an avowed theist. And with that, I'd like us to begin looking at some of the ways our conversations in Unitarian Universalist identity and how it looks at from all of our different positions, how the ways that centering ourselves in values changes our theological trajectory from being grounded in principles and sources. Not that the principles and sources are ever going to be gone, but we're expressly talking about a new way of expressing who we are. I'm curious what folks' thoughts are first on that. And before we have our answers to that question, I realize not all of you may know what our values are since Article 2 has happened this past June. And briefly, the 6 values, all centered in love, are pluralism, interdependence, generosity, equity, transformation, and justice. justice, equity, transformation, pluralism, interdependence, generosity. Learn them. No pressure.
Well, I can jump in if it's okay to go first. This whole idea of roots to leaves, I'm so glad you brought up the principles and the sources, because they are who we are, who we have been, who we've grown from. And I see values by having these value words and then some statements really open it up to me having a personal connection with these values. Not that I didn't have a personal connection with the principles. I certainly do. I became a UU when they were what drew me into the faith to begin with. But there's this sense of more growth, more layers, more opportunities to see how I can be fully human, how I can grow, how I can take a word like interdependence and see what does that mean in my life beyond even the principles and from our sources. So when I look at values such as interdependence, to just choose one of them, that permeates every part of my life. And when I start to look at how I am in relationship to nature, to other people, to communities, to systems of oppression, and can see opportunities to learn and grow. So you all named what you were, but I really am just like the true UU. I'm a little of everything, and I believe deeply and I accept deeply. And I think that these values will allow me to really live who I want to be, what I aspire to be as a Unitarian Universalist.
Thank you, Reverend Jude, and thank you, Linnea. These are very exciting topics for me to engage as well. And I'm particularly curious and motivated by one thing that you said, Linnea, that these values are able to help us be fully human. I'm grateful also to hear you center your perspective and identity as a UU. I'm curious a little bit of what that looks like in practice, to have love, I think in your words, permeate everyday life. How do UUs, and I suspect it's not different so much than Catholics, how do we allow love to permeate aspects of our life?
Thank you. Well, the first thing that comes to mind is a piece that we use in UU Wellspring from Bell Hooks, who talks about love being a verb. And so often when we hear love, we think something soft and cuddly and maybe the intimate part of love. But when you really delve into it, I'm finding that I'm sensing that my whole lens and way of being, when it's defined by love, really transforms my experience. And so when I see love as a verb, and I see all the justice work that Unitarian Universalism is known for, when it has the foundation of love, we're coming from a place of care, we're coming from a place of wanting to be in community with each other, we're coming from a place where we do want to leave a footprint that makes a better place for those who come after us. We want to be good ancestors. And so I think that this sense of love being connected to each of these values is really important to me, and really I think comes through in the Wellspring program, because it does allow for us to connect pluralism to love. Oh, well, we want to live in a pluralistic society. Oh, why is that? And what's hard about it? In fact, I led a session last night in Orlando, where I'm a volunteer leader, on pluralism and interdependence, which is probably why they came to me so quickly. But we did some work on how personally, what do we do around conflict? Do we run towards it? Do we avoid it? And by exploring our personal relationship to conflict, then we could move through. We did a heart-opening meditation, so that then we could write some apology letters, which had to do with, gosh, it really is hard to live with people who are different from us, who see the world differently, who maybe harm us. What is that relationship, and what is our role in it? So I think love, if you don't have love, it kind of all falls apart for me.
That's so powerful. I couldn't agree with you more. If you don't have love, it all comes apart. And I'm thinking in particular how these values really require you to think outside of yourself. And working towards any of these values, there is an understanding that we as people, and maybe even we in our specific religious community or religious capacity, can't work alone. We need to share the labor and share the work of loving.
And I'm curious, in your work as a chaplain, love has to come through there. And when you're connecting with people, how would you describe the love that comes through in pastoral care?
Thank you. Thank you so much for asking. As a chaplain, our task is unique, I think, in the ministry world. In so many ways, we have to love someone before they say anything. And the love has to come not as a result of who it is that we're talking to, but rather is something we must cultivate and bring with us even before we enter the room and begin to talk. And that's a tall order. Oftentimes, the difficulty for me as a chaplain is not cultivating the love to bring to the conversation, but not losing that love if someone shares something distracting to me or something that I don't understand. My job is not to fully understand, but to be a loving presence in the lives of the people that I serve. I think in the process of learning the skill of deep listening, we are often misguided, identifying that skill as something active that we must be doing on a regular basis. And in fact, deep listening, my experience is that it is more rooted in the practices that we are trying to avoid. For example, being aware of our feelings, being aware of our own personal disposition, our own predilections or preferences to certain attitudes or beliefs or even cultural affiliations. Those things get in the way of us being a loving presence. Those struggles can keep us from loving the person in front of us. I find as a chaplain, it is most difficult to hold love at the center when I get distracted.
Yep. And that love question, I think, is a challenge for a lot of us. I'll start with the local. We're a city church. We're Metro New York. New York has its reputation of having no time or being helpful for anybody. And the reality is we don't have any time. But if you're on the street and you're lost or you need help, anyone will stop and help you out for what you really need. Like there's in Metro New York, how you express love is practical often with the stranger, right? And I think about this as we've moved from intellectual principles to heart-centered values, that many of them are verbs or adjectives or emotions, that has historically been a challenge for many of us in Unitarian Universalism. And I think that some of the pressure around the change, which is, of course, change is always going to be pressure from principles to values, is also, for some folks, a feeling like, are we moving away from the intellectual into the heart-centered?
So for me, I'm a 21st century humanist and a second-gen UU. I'm in seminary, just finishing up seminary at Starr King. And this path of ministry has helped me to discover that for me, humanism is an action. It's not this thing that shows up in dusty old books, although I would argue those books are essential to who I am. But I also don't see the intellectual and the heart-centered as separate. For me, they're both and always. I have fought hard to earn that doctorate, and it's not always easy to be in a female body and intellectual in this world. And again, I think that intellectual is a word that has been misused often by people who call themselves humanist intellectuals. We're not separate from the world. We are very much a breathing part of the world. And To me, UU is a living, breathing faith, as is humanism, whether UU affiliated or not. And for me, there are principles and sources or things that I grew up with as a child. And when I hear some people nervous, some of our elders nervous about what they see as leaving the principles and moving into the values, I think it's a misconception and a misunderstanding. And it's a conversation that came up at General Assembly where people said, good, we're done with those. This is the future. That causes harm. To say things like that, because we're all in community together. And I think, well, I am not one, and poor brother Zach has had to hear about this ad infinitum, who is patient with white privilege, want to sort of push back on, and certainly Reverend Jude, this isn't what you were gesturing towards, but I want to push back on a notion that this is an either or. That's the past and this is the future. And I think, Linnea, you really spoke to that well, that this is, it is our roots to leaves. And this is a blossoming time. This is a time where we can reiterate. For me, being UU has always centered love. And being a humanist means that I have to love humanity. I think that these new values re-articulate and clarify what has always already existed in our best utopian hope for UU and for the world. And, that's to say, I think we're all on the same page. We're just having different ways of approaching it and saying it. And I'm endlessly fascinated in the ability as a New Yorker that I have to walk out and do my action as a human being, just walking down the street, whether it's talking to an unhoused person who people have ignored for a month, or, distributing food on the weekends in the park. It's an acknowledgement of our fellow humans, and being a congregation that is based in Manhattan, we have such access to such a wide variety of human beings. And, it's our work in the world is to open our doors and welcome that humanity.
Thank you, Dr. Yvonne. You mentioned whiteness. So this is a pop-up question for anybody, but for Linnea, we had some shared experiences with Loretta. For those who aren't familiar, it's the professional group for religious educators. The Loretta conferences are often sort of a petri dish or incubator for new ideas and new ways of talking. And it's not shocking to me that that's so, where that's the body that is most queer, most women, most BIPOC, members of the global majority. And I watched the struggle there for some of us white folks dealing with the touchy-feely love language for several years before beloved community language seemed to be the norm. Was that your experience, Linnea?
Yeah, I hadn't thought about it that way before, but that makes sense. I think I'd add to your list of, what people are like in Loretta is they're just so deeply passionate. And so, again, it doesn't surprise me that some of these issues that are going to permeate our entire faith is going to maybe start there, or is going to get voice there. And I think that kind of goes to the strand I was listening to earlier, that this deep listening, even listening to you, Dr. Yvonne, talk about what it means to be a humanist for you, or Brother Zachary about what it means to use love and love people before you even see them. I mean, huge learnings, just like about how to think about things in just a few moments of listening and not thinking about, well, what am I going to say next? But really just trying to hold that space and let you be completely you as you're letting me be completely me now. And so in response to your question, Reverend Jude, around Loretta being a holding space, I think that there is a lot of willingness to do that messy work of letting things come forward that we don't quite understand, and to make mistakes and to work on the repair. And, this is a big change for a lot of people. For some of us who love change, I was like, ooh, new ideas to go with for these values. But given how many changes have been in our environment that we couldn't do anything about over the past 5 years, longer, I'm sure, but in the past 4 to 5 years in particular, we couldn't change that we were in a pandemic and that our lives changed. And so I'm kind of thinking that maybe some resistance to the values is also around, maybe this is something I have some agency in, and this, my faith is so important to me. Why would I allow one more thing to change when so much has changed? So in a way, it's too bad it's the timing it is. But on the other hand, we have moved as a denomination, moved these values forward with love at the center. And I think we can, I don't know, I sense that when you put love at the center and you say it, I think one of you said, love has always been at the center of my faith. Mm-hmm. And when you look back, when we were doing research for our UU Wellspring program, I couldn't believe how many times I came across readings that said something about love being at the center. It's like, this is so not new. We have had love at the center of this faith since the beginning, but now we're formalizing it. And so when you have religious educators who are working with our youth and our children, who are so often, they've been in RE, some of them for 10, 11, 12 years. They have a really good idea of what it means to be a Unitarian Universalist. And I often turn to them to kind of feel what the heartbeat is, and our religious educators are closest to them. So all of this is really important, not only what the concepts are, but how do we roll it out? How do we engage people and not make it a forced thing, but the democratic way of coming to these new values? I don't know if that really answered your question.
Well, it's an interesting context and flavor to have. And so in this moment, this foundational moment, maybe foundational is not the right word. The buzzword in the past would have been paradigm shift. I'm sure today it's more like inflection point. There's a struggle we saw with the language shift that brought tension along an intellectual level, a change level, personal agency. Dr. Vaughn lifted up some stereotypes that are sometimes true about intellectuals and humanists, but are not always true. And I just lifted up, after she mentioned whiteness, that some of this awkwardness in our congregations is this language is less historically Western white of a certain kind of intersection of identities, whiteness, I don't know, that I love that language, still love it. I have the 8 principles memorized, written on the tablet of my heart, right? But there's multiple layers of challenge for this that are hitting people in our faith right now in different ways. Yeah. Pedagogically, I remember taking a week-long 40-hour symposium with some of our elder MREs, the early greats, and they were teaching us how we did our curricula every generation, going back to Hosea Ballou, and we were looking at the curricula that he wrote for Bible study, and we go another generation, and understanding what our educators or our curricula writers who were, Hosea Ballou is a minister also, so not only educators, how those flavors and styles shifted in each generation was fascinating to me. And that's part of what Roots to Leave started with. Let's look at every generation of theological thought and what were the shifts. And last year we were looking at it, the deep questions. Wellspring had them also, looking at our principles. And the curricula for deep questions was very much like, not that it wasn't spiritual, but it was a mixture of intellectual and spiritual, and what we would call a flipped classroom. People would go home with some homework and come back and talk it through. And what I'm seeing in Wellspring this year is much more of a praxis of shared narratives and meaning. What are our stories? Like, we're the scripture in a sense. And I'm fascinated, any of you can answer this, of course, with that curricular shift in this new generation of this new time, as we're entering into an endemic, or we've shifted into an endemic. Why does that all matter right now? Why are all those changes happening right now?
Brother Zachary, you look like you're just like ready to go.
I'm so excited. I also don't want to cover either of you because this conversation that's developing within a UU context is very interesting to me. And I would say Unitarian Universalism interests me, not simply because I am employed by a Unitarian Universalist church, but as a Catholic, the principle of ecumenism and how we hold to our individual identities and traditions while being participants in a pluralist world are deeply interesting and also at stake in my tradition. I'm thinking about what you said, Linnea, as you were uncovering some of the, let me say, traditional sources of Unitarian Universalism, that love at the center was not a new idea or a new concept, that it was very much built upon the tradition that currently exists. And I have to say, as a Catholic, a big difference between our traditions, where Unitarian Universalists might be grounded in values, Catholics very much see themselves grounded in tradition. We see our practice grounded in our community, but also circumscribed by tradition in explicit ways.
Yeah.
As I was preparing to join this podcast, it struck me in a very powerful way just how much of Catholic tradition echoes the values of holding love at the center of everything, especially when we consider some of the conflicts taking place within Catholicism. There are adherents to the praxis of the Pope Benedict, for example, and others who are very interested in the words and practice of Pope Francis now. And those Catholics who want to adhere to one pope or another seem to like to compete with one another and argue with one another about what it means to be a true good Catholic. We forget that both of those popes, as well as popes past, have centered Catholic practice in love, that we are to be a loving presence, and it is in this way that we will be known through our faith. The Catholic tradition lists the Catechism as the document that holds our faith, and also it is what Catholic religious educators use to impart our faith to the next generation. How do we teach religion? And fundamentally, I also think there are more consonances than dissonances. The Catechism lifts love as the central value. Love is the practice by which Catholicism gains its feet and performs love in the world. These similarities to me are far more striking and interesting than differences. I could list any number of differences between Catholic tradition and UU practice, but it's this similarity that's got me most excited.
As I'm listening to you speak, Brother Zach, I'm someone who's still in seminary. And first of all, I totally vote for Meadville and Star King to have classes on the new values. It's so important for anyone going into ministry. But, from day one as a baby UU, something that I was taught then and then is reiterated in seminary are the differences and that you mentioned. And, the big one that is often spoken about in our courses is that UU is a non-creedal faith, that we are covenantal. And some of the confusion, I'm going to be gentle in the way I talk about it, confusion around the values from some of our elders, I think, has come from, they're trying to introduce a creed. It's just an iteration of who we already are. And as I'm thinking about what you said about Catholicism, your experience and how your understanding of Catholicism in the world, we are all human beings trying to love each other the best way we can. And I think that's so essential, particularly for those of us, like pretty much everyone in this room right now, who centers a lot of our practice around social justice work. It's how do we collaborate? How do we covenant together, even if we have different spaces and faiths and beings in the world, to love the world in all of its messed up glory, and to do the work that needs to happen.
I love that you mentioned create. So for folks that are interested, UUs have a nice fallacy that we like to do around the principles and our sources, and we'll see what we're going to do with their values. But our sources are essentially that, and our polity are essentially our ecclesiology, how we do church and how does the Spirit move through all of us. Our principles, which begin with action statement, where we, the member congregations, affirm to covenant and promote, is a dogmatics. We just haven't written a book about it.
Yeah.
But that's not a creed. So we have the structures other churches have. We just haven't educated our people in what they mean. But someone could do a PhD on dogmatics of our principles and do it that would be fully non-creedal and fully in our tradition. And that's some of what's helpful when we have conversations in pluralism with other traditions, to figure out, oh, wow, why are we saying this about this? It's utterly not true. And what's it based in? And it's based in probably grief in some way, right? We've come from, someone's harmed us, whether we come from another tradition or we grew up in UU, and when we got out of RE, religious education, we didn't have worship to go to because we never saw it before. Whatever the range of it is, we always have opportunities to be disappointed and have grief about what's central to our faith life.
I'm so glad that you said that, Reverend Jude. I think grief motivates a lot of individuals, both within and without my tradition. Catholicism, in practice, as it is lived out, trying to hold some of that creedal dogmatics causes damage in the lives of individuals and in communities. It has, in the past and in the present, split families and kept us from performing that love in the smallest ways and in the largest ways. I don't think that Catholics are unique in that. And I think that when we look at how we perform religion, putting love at the center has traditionally been a lot more difficult to do than to say. We've been saying it for a long time, but just as I was describing some of the conflicts in my tradition, Reverend Jude, I hear you speaking both directly and indirectly to some of the conflicts within Unitarian Universalism today.
Yes, and Dr. Yvonne just made an observation and began it with, I'll try to be, gentle with this? Not that this podcast isn't going to be on the internet for all eternity, but there's a thing that we've got our stuff too.
Oh yeah.
And these stories are so important to who we eventually are and how we're growing. I love a line that the Reverend Dr. Natalie Fenimore wrote in To Wake to Rise. She has a really lovely, poignant essay on how to welcome people. But the line that always stays with me is, and I wrote it down, when we welcome all our stories into the DNA of our faith, we add value, richness, and depth. And that includes the stories, of things that happen at Laredo conferences. It includes when, things are challenging, but it also includes the joyful stories, the stories of Unitarian Universalism saving people's lives. Every one of these stories changes our DNA or adds to our DNA and is part of it. And I think that if we can remember that these stories, whether it's baggage or otherwise, are coming with people. And so whether it's a different culture or religion that they grew up with, they're bringing a part of that. Even if they're letting go of much of it, they are bringing a part of it. And so the values seem to bring us together. Love, certainly. But the other values as well, we can take our histories, we can take our stories and connect to these values in a unique way. But when we do it in a covenanted circle, whether it's on Zoom or in person, and we share our stories deeply. The values come through. And I think when we hear ourselves speak about things that are so meaningful to us in story form, and then we attach it to a value or a covenant statement that we're engaging in for that particular session. When I think of a Wellspring session, we learn new things about ourselves. You know, you certainly learn from other people, but somehow, as Parker Palmer tells us, our souls are these wild animals, and we need this safe space where people are deeply listening and holding us. And I love that line. It's going to really stay with me, that, you know, you have love for everyone before they even open their mouths. And when you feel that in the group, you truly are adding to our faith by telling your story and having your truth out there. That's one of the things I love about Unitarian Universalism as a whole.
That is a beautiful way to end, Linnea, looking at Reverend Natalie Fenimore's writing around the DNA, getting the stories in our DNA. And as I noticed from the pedagogy of that program in Love at the Center, it is very much a praxis of shared narratives and meaning making. And that's theology. I remember in seminary, the great Dr. James Cone would teach us that theology is how we make and understand meaning in the world. And that's what we're doing when we're sharing our stories with one another. And that's what we're going to do for the rest of this season. We are doing a deeper dive, not so much into Wellspring, but into the values where love is at the center: justice, equity, transformation, interdependence, generosity, pluralism, and what those shared narratives mean in context with each other. And we'll be bringing on board members from Wellspring and curricula authors to help understand how did they get to where they got to in each session. But it's an opportunity for us to introduce Unitarian Universalists a little more deeply to what our newly expressed values are. They've always been there, as several of us here have said, but we've got new, simpler language for them. It has been an honor to have you with us, Linnea. Thank you so much for taking the time. I'm Reverend Jude. This has been the first session in our third season of Roots to Leaves. And again, gratitude to Linnea, Brother Zachary, and Dr. Yvonne for joining us today.
Thank you. It's been an honor.